1943, Bengal experienced one of the most horrific famines in modern history. The images are haunting: starving children, skeletal figures, and streets lined with the dead. An estimated 3 million people perished. For decades, the official story was that this was a natural disaster, a simple, tragic case of crop failure and bad weather. But the truth, hidden in economic records and government archives, is far more disturbing. The Bengal famine was not caused by a lack of food. It was an artificial famine, created by economic policies and wartime decisions. This is the story of how millions were starved to death in a land of plenty. To understand what happened, we need to go back to World War II. Britain was fighting for its survival, and its vast empire was mobilized to support the war effort. India, the so-called jewel in the crown, became the backbone of the British military campaign in Asia. It supplied everything: food, jute for sandbags, cotton for uniforms, ammunition, and raw materials. Indian factories worked around the clock, and its farms fed the Allied soldiers. But there was a huge problem. Britain was broke. The war had drained its treasury, and it simply didn't have the money to pay for all these Indian goods. So, how do you get what you need without paying for it? The British government came up with a clever, but ultimately catastrophic, accounting trick. Instead of paying India in gold or pound sterling that could be used immediately, they created a system called sterling balances. Essentially, India would ship real, tangible goods to Britain, and in return, Britain would give India an IOU. The payment was recorded as a credit, a debt to be settled sometime after the war. These credits were held in London and were completely unusable inside India. This created a secondary problem. The Indian producers, the farmers, and factory owners still needed to be paid for their goods. They weren't going to accept an IOU from a distant government. So, to pay them, the colonial administration in India did something drastic. They started printing money. Massive amounts of it. Between 1939 and 1943, the total supply of rupees in circulation in India exploded by over 600%. Now, anyone with a basic understanding of economics knows what happens. When you flood an economy with new money without a corresponding increase in goods available for people to buy, you get inflation. And in wartime India, it was hyperinflation. The prices of everything shot through the roof. Especially food, and this is the crucial point. Food did not disappear from Bengal. The markets were not empty. In fact, historical records show that the 1943 rice harvest, while slightly below average, was actually higher than in 1941, a year when there was no famine. The rice was there. You could see it, smell it, piled high in the marketplaces. The problem was that millions of people could no longer afford to buy it. Think about who was protected from this inflation. People with stable, rising incomes did okay. If you were a soldier in the British Indian Army, your wages kept up. If you were an industrial worker in Calcutta, producing war materials, you were fine. If you were a trader who could profit from the rising prices, you actually got richer. These groups could still afford to buy food, even at inflated prices. But who was left behind? The most vulnerable, landless agricultural laborers, fishermen, barbers, potters, and other rural workers. Their wages remained stagnant. A farm laborer who earned a few annas a day suddenly found that his daily wage, which once could buy enough rice for his family, could now barely buy a handful. They were watching food prices climb higher and higher every day, while their income stayed exactly the same. They were trapped. They would go to the market and see mountains of grain, but their pockets were empty. They were priced out of survival. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, who was a child in Bengal during the famine, later developed a groundbreaking theory based on this tragedy. Kededit, an entitlement, famine. It wasn't about the total availability of food in a region. It was about people's ability to access it, their entitlement to food, which comes from their purchasing power. Inflation had systematically destroyed the entitlements of the rural poor in Bengal. As if this economic devastation wasn't enough, disastrous military policies made the situation infinitely worse. In 1942, the Japanese army had conquered Burma and was threatening to invade India through Bengal. In a panic, The British military implemented a denial policy. The idea was to deny resources to a potential invading army. Under this policy, the army confiscated anything that could be useful to the Japanese. This included rice stocks. Officials went through villages and forcibly seized surplus rice from farmers and merchants, further disrupting the market and creating panic. Even more catastrophically, they targeted transportation. Bengal is a land of rivers, and for centuries, boats were the lifeblood of the rural economy, used to transport goods, people, and especially food from farms to markets. The British Army confiscated or destroyed tens of thousands of local boats, fearing they could be used by the Japanese. This decision was a death sentence for countless communities. It shattered the local transport network, isolating entire regions and cutting them off from food supplies. A district might have a surplus of rice, but without boats, there was no way to get it to a neighboring district where people were starving. The crisis deepened, and the world was not blind to it. Offers of help came from abroad. The United States and Canada offered to ship grain. Australia had a massive surplus of wheat that it was ready to send, but the British wartime cabinet, led by Winston Churchill, repeatedly blocked or delayed these shipments. Churchill's attitude towards India was notoriously hostile. He viewed the famine as a problem of the Indians' own making, famously remarking that they breed like rabbits. Official communications from the time reveal a shocking lack of urgency. When desperate requests for food aid reached London, the cabinet prioritized building up food stockpiles in Britain and supplying the war effort in Europe. Ships that could have carried grain to Calcutta were diverted to the Mediterranean. The argument was always that every ship was needed for the war against Germany. India's suffering was consistently placed at the bottom of the priority list. By the time relief was finally organized and delivered, it was too little, too late. Millions had already died. They died in their villages. They died on the roads as they walked towards the cities in a desperate search for food. And they died on the pavements of Calcutta, often just meters away from well-stocked shops and restaurants. The Bengal Famine of 1943 was not an act of God. It was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe, born from a toxic mix of colonial economic exploitation, reckless monetary policy, disastrous military strategy, and a profound indifference to Indian lives. It was the predictable result of choices made by powerful men in London and Delhi. It demonstrates a terrifying truth. You don't need bombs or bullets to kill millions. You can do it with inflation. You can do it with bad policy. You can do it by simply deciding that some lives are worth less than others. This was not just a famine. It was an economic massacre, imposed upon one of the most vulnerable populations on Earth. And it's a chapter of history we should never forget. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden corners of our past. See you next time.